This session will be recorded and posted onto the IACC website, so probably next week. And I think that's it. I would now like to introduce Chris Malone. Chris?
Okay, thanks, Cynthia. Yeah, so my name's Chris Malone with the City of Vancouver. Been with the city for about 22 years, and a lot of that time has been dealing with designing transportation projects or financing transportation projects. And then in the last 5 or 10 years or so, I've kind of moved to more public-wide financing and asset management type duties. But I do have a lot of history with transportation. So this presentation has changed in the last few days because of the Supreme Court's decision on 976, and could even be retitled now like a success story, at least for the time being. But it's a good thing with the court's decision and helpful for the city of Vancouver to fund transportation. So I'll get into it here. So as far as the presentation goes, I'll cover kind of a brief introduction for the city of Vancouver. I'll give a brief history on how the city of Vancouver has funded transportation. And then we'll talk about, I'll do an introduction of the street funding strategy, which is what we call our new transportation revenue sources for funding transportation. I'll talk about what those revenue sources are and how that money is spent. And then I'll talk about the impacts of I-976 and COVID. And then future options, which I think are still applicable, even though 976 did get struck down. I think it kind of shows that there's a need for maybe some forward thinking for new revenue sources for transportation. So we'll get into that. As far as the city of Vancouver, it's if people haven't had a chance to come over here, beautiful area located along the Columbia River across the state line from Portland, Oregon. It was settled by the Hudson's Bay Trading Company, and in fact, there's still a historic Fort Vancouver along the waterfront that they tried to keep it in period of the time that it was still a fur trading post. And then the city itself was actually incorporated in 1857. And then there's some lineal footages and miles of different asset types just to give people kind of a order of magnitude of the size of the city. And if people had a chance to attend the funding roundtable that was just ended just a few minutes ago, we've been able to use a lot of the different revenue sources that were talked about, whether it be STBG or TIB or the Public Works Board, or Safe Routes to School. And in fact, we actually are just wrapping up a project with the Public Works Board where we upgraded about 12 or 13,000 of our 17,000 streetlights from the high pressure sodium to the more efficient LED streetlights. And we're actually paying the debt service on that loan from a Public Works Board with energy savings that we've received from upgrading those lights. So really a good success story and different ways of using some of those funding strategies that they talked about previously. This slide is a little old. It's from 2016, but what I like about it is it shows a literal mountain of debt. So historically, the city of Vancouver has tried to find an ongoing stable revenue source to fund transportation. And each time it kind of petered out, and they decided just to issue more bonds to pay for a select list of projects. And you can see, this goes back into the 1990s of attempt after attempt, and it just keeps, the decision was at the time to just keep bonding for new projects. And you can see the debt keeps rising until in 2012, our annual debt service reached about $5 million per year. And that was pretty staggering for our city council, for our citizens, for the staff members. And I think that helped spur some change back in 2012 and kind of got us to where we are now. But this graph also shows the different revenue sources that we have been using over the years to pay for debt. So you can see there's general fund is a big portion, and then there's an employee surcharge, which is basically a business license surcharge or a fee per employee that we charge businesses, and a lot of that money is going to pay off debt service. Then there's some debt service being paid by the gas tax distributions from the state, and then some debt is being paid by the real estate excise taxes that come in to our general fund as well. Uh, I just wanted to point out that back in, I don't remember the exact year, but back in the early 2000s, they actually were successful. The city council was of enacting a 0.2% increase in the sales tax that was to be dedicated towards transportation. Unfortunately, at the same exact time, there was also an issue with lack of funding for police and fire. And so immediately, almost months after that 2.2% sales tax increase was enacted, it got diverted from transportation to police and fire, and then they decided to issue debt. So even when we did have success back then, we still struggled to keep it going. And again, that kind of plays into what ultimately happened here with our street funding strategy. And just another side note, this debt you can see continues to keep falling off. And the current debt schedule is that we'll have it all paid off in about 2035. So still quite a ways to go, but it continually drops off as time goes on. So the street funding strategy. So I talked about the fact that in 2012, our debt service hit about 5 million per year. Additionally, we were coming out of the recession, the Great Recession. We were coming out of that at the same time, and we also had a pretty strong and a good leadership at the council level that was really dedicated to getting something done for transportation. And we had some staff members that had a lot of tenure, and they were also motivated and dedicated to get something done uh, in regards to transportation funding. So all is kind of a perfect storm at that time. And so everyone kind of did a lot of outreach, whether it be city council or staff members or even advocates for for transportation funding, citizen wide or stakeholders or businesses. There's a lot of outreach and kind of gathering what could be done, what are some different options, how much do we need, things like that. So for several years there was a lot of just information gathering. And then in January of 2015, the council actually enacted a commission called the Street Funding Commission. And it was a cross section of stakeholders, business owners, agencies like school districts and such, citizens, neighborhood leaders, et cetera, that their task was to find ongoing, make recommendations about ongoing revenue sources for transportation and how that money should be used. So they took the lead and worked for most of 2015 on outreach with different stakeholders and coming up with different options. They did some polling of the citizens to kind of see what people would be willing to pay for transportation, that kind of thing. And in October of 2015, they came out with their written recommendations. And in November, the city council approved the recommendations and moved forward with some ordinances to start implementing that. So those ordinances created a transportation benefit district, and then they also increased the business license surcharge, and they increased the utility tax, which I'll touch a little bit more on those later. They also recommended that debt service, as it gets paid off, gets reinvested back into transportation. And then also at about that same time, the state had done a recalculation or a redistribution of gas taxes to municipalities. And so the city of Vancouver got a little bump in gas tax revenues. And that was also recommended to be included in the street funding strategy package. So city council went through that entire process, and then the revenue started coming in 2016. And it should be noted that all of those things that they implemented were all council manic. So nothing required a public vote yet. The recommendations that came from the Street Funding Commission included some guiding principles about the revenues themselves, and then also some outcomes about what should be achieved. So, as far as the guiding principles, they wanted to make sure that we supplemented, not supplanted, existing street funds. And so, what they were scared of is if new money came in specifically for transportation, someone could come along and say, well, you have all this general fund money going to pay for transportation. You don't need that since you have this new money. And that was not the intent. They wanted to make sure that this new money was added on top of what was already there to pay for transportation operations and maintenance and paving, et cetera. They also wanted to make sure that whatever revenue sources were enacted were equitable for all users. So whether it be businesses or citizens or agencies, they wanted kind of everyone to pay their fair share into funding the street improvements. They also wanted predictability of funding. They were trying to minimize the impacts of recessions or different problems that might occur with like real estate excise tax or sales tax. So I think what they intended to do was kind of provide, like you do with your retirement portfolio, kind of different revenue sources that if one went down, maybe the others wouldn't be affected as much, kind of thing. They also wanted to provide better improved annual reporting to the council and the community. I think the intent was to be better at transparency and accountability for this new money that was coming in and how it was going to be spent. And then another requirement that they put in there was that if there was any proposal to shift the money away from streets at a future date, they'd have to go through as much public process that was done originally to make these upfront decisions, which was about a 10-month process with a lot of outreach. So they wanted to ensure that it couldn't easily be shifted away from streets. And then the last item I had mentioned is the reinvestment of transportation debt service back into streets as the debt service is paid off. As far as the outcomes, so that was kind of the guiding principles for the new revenue. The outcomes they wanted to achieve, and a lot of this was based on community feedback. They wanted to improve right-of-way maintenance to pre-recessionary levels. They wanted to improve pavement condition over a 20-year span from fair to good. They wanted to set aside some money for asset replacement for assets that are near the end of their useful life to replace them. Right now, we're using that for replacing streetlights and traffic signals that are near the end of their life. They also wanted to improve multimodal accessibility and safety for all modes of travel. And then they wanted a local match to be available for the city to pursue grant opportunities. So they wanted some money set aside for that. And then they also wanted to improve sidewalk maintenance citywide. This slide is intended to show some of the questions that they asked the public when they went out to do the polling. So on the left side is, if the basic question they asked is, if you had 4 different revenue sources, which one would you choose first, second, third, and fourth to pay for transportation improvements? And so the results are the vehicle license fee was the top ranking revenue source that the citizens had voted on if they had to pay for a new fee for transportation. Second was the business license surcharge fee. The third and fourth were kind of tied between property taxes and sales taxes. You can see that on the left side. On the right side is kind of following up on that question of these revenue sources. How much would you be willing to pay as a new tax to pay for transportation? And obviously, if you put 0 in there, that's going to be a popular choice. No one wants to pay new taxes. So you have a lot of zeros. But when you look at the amount of money that people were willing to pay if they had to, for example, in the top one, vehicle license fee, the most support was for a $20 vehicle license fee renewal fee, which is a fee the Transportation Benefit District has the authority to implement. And then you can see if you go up to $40, it drops down to 26% of people were supportive of that. So it drops down pretty quickly after that $20. Going down to the next one, the business license surcharge, you can see that if people had to pay, there was support for like a $10 increase in the business license surcharge, and then it drops as the fee gets higher and higher. As you go down to property taxes, there you can see there's a lot of people that didn't want property tax or sales tax, and if they did, they wanted a very low increase, a 0.1% for each of them. So I'll get into this, but what ended up happening is kind of what was what was voted or on this polling. These are non-scientific polls, but what was the consensus from these, or the results from these polls, kind of drove what the city council and the street funding commission ultimately recommended and adopted. So this, I'll kind of unpack this slide slowly for everyone. These are the different revenue sources that made up our street funding strategy. So remember, this is above and beyond what was already there for operations and maintenance and paving for streets. This is all new money to be set aside for new purposes. So let's start with the top line, the vehicle license fees. The decision was to implement a $20 vehicle license fee in 2016. And the way the vehicle license fee is collected is the first year of enactment, you only get about half a year's of collection. So 2016 is a half year's worth of collections. 2017 was the first full year of vehicle license fee collections. Then in 2018, in keeping with the recommendations from the Street Funding Commission, the Transportation Benefit District voted to implement a $40 fee. And that was the recommendation was that's as high as the fee would go. So there was a $20 initial, and then 2 years later, there would be a $40. So in 2018 is the first year of the $40, which is a half year. It's a full year collection of 20 plus a half year collection of 40. And then 2019 is the first full year of the $40 collections. And we anticipated about $5 million per year coming in for that. And it's pretty accurate to what we expected. And that at the end of 2019 was also when voters approved I-976. And so starting in at the end of 2019, we started putting money into like a separate account in case refunds had to be issued, depending on what the court decided. And just recently, the court decided to strike down the constitutionality of I-976. So what that means is that we will have about $5 million in 2020 that's already been collected, and we'll put that back into funding transportation. And we anticipate that we'll have at least most of that money available for 2021. But we also are cautious that either the legislature will make changes because they're trying to do with the will of the voters, or there'll be another ballot measure coming forward to try to restrict these fees again. And so we have some plans that I'll touch on later in this presentation about what to do in the long run. But at least for the next couple of years, or at least for 2020 and 2021, we have some money that we can set aside and program for certain uses. The next line on the slide is the business license surcharge. So in 2016, there was a surcharge already in place to pay for debt service, which I showed on that earlier graph. And that surcharge was about $50 per employee, I believe. In 2016, they raised it to $60, and that extra $10 would go to transportation. So that's what's reflected here. In 2018, they increased it to $20. So it ultimately went from 50 up to 70. And you can see those numbers are continuing to come in just under $1 million per year. The one caveat to that is that because of COVID, the city suspended collection of the business license surcharge for 2020. That happened about March or April. And so we did collect about a quarter's worth of revenues for 2020, but then the rest of 2020, we're not going to collect revenues. And then for 2021, we've suspended it until March or April of 2021. So we're only anticipating getting about 3/4 of the year of collections on that because of COVID. The utility tax is the next line. So the utility tax is a tax that the city taxes its own water, sewer, and storm utilities. And the revenues from that tax go to the general fund. So one of the funding options for transportation was a 1.5% increase to that tax. And that 1.5% increase equates ultimately to almost $2 million per year. You can see that in years 2019, 20, and 21. And we luckily have not seen too much of a drop off because of COVID with our utility revenues. The uh, really the only drops we've seen are from non-payment or delinquencies. And to date, we're looking at about $1 million in losses due to non-payment and delinquencies. And in general, we bring in about $100 million in revenue. So really, it's about a 1% loss on our utilities right now due to COVID. So not too bad. We were expecting a little bit higher loss, but it's looking pretty good. So we're projecting our utility tax revenues will be pretty consistent as well. The next line item is debt service retirement. So as debt gets paid off, the money that's freed up from that gets reinvested back into transportation. And you can see that the dollar values keep increasing year after year. Although after 2021, it levels out for a while, probably for about 6 years, and then it starts dropping off again. So ultimately, like by the year 2035, there should be about $5 million in revenue that goes towards transportation, but it'll take a while to get to that point. And then the last item here is the gas tax. So this is that gas tax redistribution I had talked about. Not a big sum of money, about $500,000 per year, but better than nothing. And you can see in 2021 the amount of revenues we're anticipating the amount of revenues decreasing by about half because people are driving less due to COVID, and then hopefully it rebounds in 2021. Another important point here is in 2019, that was really an accurate year of revenue collections. So about $10 million a year from all these new revenue sources. And just to give you an order of magnitude, that's about 25% of all the revenues that go towards transportation, approximately. So we have about $40 million that comes in for transportation, and this equated to about to 10 million of it, so about a quarter of it. One thing that isn't reflected here, though, is some of these revenues allowed us to pursue grant opportunities. And so we were pretty successful in the last 3 years when we had the money of getting approximately $7 million per year on average in grant money. So really, we're losing out more than just this. If we had lost that vehicle license fee, we would have lost out on about $7 million in grants per year too. So it was a pretty big hit to our transportation revenues, which we've kind of bought some time with the change on I-976. And then this is how we spent the money. So this is right in line with the outcomes that the Street Funding Commission had recommended. The median right-of-way maintenance. So we wanted to improve right-of-way maintenance, and that's pretty consistent through the years. We wanted to improve our pavement condition from fair to good. So you can see we allocated money towards pavement preservation and reconstruction. And in 2020, it dropped because of COVID and just some cost saving measures, but we anticipate that it bumping back up in future years. And we're being cautious right now. We're not allocating as much as we were originally going to pavements because there's a few things in flux. One, we're not sure the long-term viability of the vehicle license fee. And then also the city council is currently kind of struggling with, should we be putting more money towards multimodal and safety improvements and reducing the amount we put into pavement preservation. So that's kind of an ongoing issue and will be resolved in the next few months. But right now, the plan is to put a lot of money towards pavement preservation, and then we may increase the amount of money that goes towards multimodal safety and accessibility. So that next line item is that multimodal safety and accessibility. And the original plan was about $600,000 per year. That program originally got cut because of I-976. Now that we have it back, it will be restored and maybe even bumped up a little bit above the 600,000, depending on council feedback. And then the arterial street upgrades. So these are large arterial improvements that typically are the ones that qualify for the big grant opportunities. And so what we originally, the plan was to allocate about $3.5 million per year towards these type of projects. And then so obviously that got impacted by Initiative 976 too. But in addition to that, we we wanted to save money for the future because as these projects progress, the most the part that costs the most is the construction phase, and so we wanted to kind of put some money in reserves and be have that money available for when these projects hit the construction phase. So that's why you see that we're spending only about $2 million per year when actually we're setting aside some money as well for future construction contracts. And then asset replacements, that was that program I had talked about, replacing assets when they reach the end of their useful life. And right now we're using that to fund street signals and street lights. And again, that was another program that was cut because of Initiative 976, will likely be restored now that the court has overturned that. And then sidewalk management was the last outcome that the Street Funding Commission had recommended. And that was reduced to $250,000 because of Initiative 976. That'll likely be bumped up to back up to $500,000. And that's a program that basically allows us to reach out to property owners, because in our city, it's the property owner's responsibility to maintain the sidewalk. And so we can reach out to them if there's a defect in the sidewalk or bushes that need to be trimmed, et cetera. That this program reaches out to those folks, and then if there's an issue with paying for it, there's also a program where they can request for help to pay for sidewalk improvements if needed. So this slide still is applicable. It's changed a little bit. In the short term, because of Initiative 976, we had some reserves that had been built up, like I had talked about, for future grant projects, and we had been spending that down for some arterial projects that were getting ready to be constructed. We also had reduced the programs, like I had talked about. We reduced the multimodal program and the asset replacement program and the sidewalk management program to try to help offset some of those revenue losses. So those are the short-term fixes. The long-term, the city council has agreed to talk about the issue of what happens long-term in 2021. So we're going to wait till 2021, and we're going to talk to it with our city council. And I think where we're headed is, because of the voters approving I-976, it's likely that we'll probably want to implement something that's a little stronger than just a council manic fee. We'll probably want to do some kind of a voter approved fee. And so the Transportation Benefit District has the authority to implement the vehicle license renewal fees and or property tax increases and or sales tax increases. So they have the authority to implement those. The vehicle license fee was council manic. The other two require voter approval. What I think we're headed is, we'll probably end up on wanting to go in front of the voters with something, and probably the easiest option is a vehicle license fee that would be voter approved. Even though it may not be required by state law, we may end up going to the voters and just getting that approved, so that if a future ballot measure comes along that strikes it down, or if the legislature does something, there's something that's more concrete that the voters have approved to go towards transportation. There's a lot up in the air still, a lot of conversations to be had, but we're leaning towards some kind of a voter approved option. Here's some of the issues, the struggles that we're going to run into is, this is the voting within the city limits by precinct for Initiative 976. And the blue is in favor of the initiative, which means reducing the TBD, right, or taking away the TBD's authority to implement the vehicle license fee. And the darker the blue, the more in favor of the initiative they were. The brown was opposed to the initiative, and the darker the brown, the more opposed they were. So you can see on this map where it's really dark brown, that's kind of our downtown area. So the downtown area was really, I think they opposed the Initiative 976, but really the majority of the rest of the city was in favor of Initiative 976. So we have our work cut out for us. If we want to go towards a voter approved initiative, we're going to have to really get out there and talk to people about what this money, how much comes in and where the money gets spent and how it gets spent, and try to really improve the accountability and transparency that that we're doing to try to get some of these voters to change their mind and approve some kind of a voter revenue source for transportation. And that concludes my presentation. There's a web link on this page if people are interested in going to the City of Vancouver's website / Better Streets. On that webpage is our annual reports that we put out that talk about the revenues that we bring in each year and how we spend that money. And then additionally, there's a story map which tells the story of transportation finance here at the city historically, and then how we got through the street funding strategy, and then where we're going from here. And then there's other background documents such as ordinances and meeting notes and things like that for City Council and our Transportation Benefit District. So a lot of information on that website if jurisdictions are interested in kind of seeing what we put together to fund our streets. And my name is on this slide, and there's an email address if people have questions about the City of Vancouver's approach. And then I think we can also field some questions here during this presentation if there are some.
Great, thank you, Chris. This is Kathy. I'm taking over as host because Cynthia's VPN went down. And so there are a few questions, I believe, in the chat box. Tina, what do we got?
Yeah, we've got a couple questions for you, Chris. First is, how does Vancouver establish its funding level for pavement preservation?
There is a policy, and I don't have it on the top of my head right now, but if you email that to me, or if I can find someone to send it to, it's based on a certain dollar amount per lane mile of streets in the city. So it's basically a policy decision that says we're going to pay X amount towards pavement management for every lane mile that we own in the city. And that's really how it gets paid for. And then that policy changed when we implemented the street funding strategy. It kind of increased the amount appropriately with the new revenues that came in.
Great, thank you. We have another question. How does the city address ADA curb ramp replacements?
It's a big topic right now. Not only that, but sidewalk infill and bicycle facilities. Basically, all modes of multimodal travel is a big issue right now. And what we've been telling people is we do a lot of curb ramp and sidewalk and bike facilities when we do our large arterial projects. Like we'll do a mile at a time, improving an entire arterial with all those facilities. We do a ton, like millions of dollars a year of work with our pavement management program. So they're required to, not required, but they do put, like I said, millions of dollars per year towards ADA ramp improvements and sidewalk infill along the streets that they're paving. And then additionally, when a new development comes in, we require those developers to install sidewalk and curb ramps in front of their properties when they're, if they're missing or deficient. So those are really how we get it. We also have that multimodal safety and accessibility program, which help to do little spot improvements here or there. But really the majority of ramps and sidewalk work are done by arterials and paving and developers.
Thanks, Chris. Got another question. Another long-term trend for transportation funding is the increase in electric vehicles. As an example, the Transportation Improvement Board relies on gas taxes as a revenue source, but electric vehicles don't pay the gas tax. Does any of the electric vehicle registration surcharge go to fund transportation infrastructure? What does the future look like?
So I cannot remember, and maybe someone else might know about this, but I think electric vehicles pay a fee for renewing their tabs. And with that fee that they pay, there's that 40 for if you're within the city limits, you pay the $40 to the transportation benefit district. So electric vehicles are paying the same as a gas vehicle when they renew their tabs. There's a lot of other things that go into electric vehicle usage, and I'm not an expert on that. But as far as how we currently collect our fees, they're treated similar to a gas vehicle, I think, as far as revenue collections.
Thank you. And that was the last of the questions in the chat. Does anyone else want to submit a question? You can submit it directly to me or to everyone in the chat.
And I see we have Cynthia back. Glad your VPN's back up there.
Yeah, it just completely glitched out. All of a sudden, Chris stopped talking. I was like, well, and then he just went away. So sorry about that.
Okay, any other questions for Chris? All right.
There are none.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing that information with us, Chris, and for kind of updating it at the last minute with the new developments. And just want to remind everyone that we will be posting the slide deck and a recording of this session on the website. I will be sending you an email after the conference letting you know when those are available. So thanks to everyone for joining us. The next session will start at 11:30. And for this track, that next session is navigating what's next using local government financial data with a couple of smart and interesting presenters. And then also, if you're interested in the other track going on, the tribal track, there's a session starting at 11:30, leveraging intergovernmental partnerships. So we hope that you can join us for one or the other of those. Again, thanks, Chris, and thanks everybody for joining us.